Our team at Bible Project has been working hard to creatively visualize the ideas and the message of the Sermon on the Mount with animation in a new 10-part series that's releasing this year. And it just so happens there's a fellow creative who has done very similar work to us, not with animation, but with cinema. You may know The Chosen, a multi-season show about the life of Jesus. Well, Michelle and I call up the creator of The Chosen, Dallas Jenkins, and talk to him about how the Sermon on the Mount has been central to the way that he and his team writes and structures the show. Dallas, thanks for joining us.
Oh, thanks so much for having me on. I'm a big fan.
We are too. Tell us a little bit about the Sermon on the Mount. It seems like such a pivotal part of seasons 1 through 3 and the whole narrative structure that you're doing.
Yeah. To get to the Sermon on the Mount, we looked at it and said, okay, this is one of the most pivotal set of teachings in the history of the world. And it's clear that Jesus delivered these things more than once. As you know, lots of scholars believe this might have been a collection of multiple sermons, of multiple teachings. So knowing that, we thought, we're going to take the teachings of the Sermon on the Mount, but we're going to put them into this context of the moment where the crowds are coming, the word is spreading. Jesus is about to really lay the gauntlet down and go, I'm here, I'm the Messiah, and I've got a new way of looking at things for you. And we're going to do that all at once for thousands of people. It seemed to match well the growth of the ministry. The final thing I'll say is that we wanted it to be delivered in a way that wasn't just a 30-minute sermon back to back. What if the Beatitudes were not just delivered for the masses, but they also had a personal intention? They were perhaps even the result of Jesus seeing humanity and going, humanity needs to hear this specific thing because they have failed in this specific area. And so in the season finale, when Jesus delivers the Beatitudes and he's telling Matthew what they are, we see how specifically they have been applied and who they apply to his friends, to the people who've been following him. We have heard from all over the world that people were weeping during that, saying, I've never thought of the fact that those words weren't just for a crowd of hundreds of people or just weren't for the entire world. They were for me specifically, or they were for Jesus' friends specifically. Doesn't change the words, doesn't change the meaning. It drives it home even more.
So what made you decide, or how did you decide what to include, what not to include, and what to give weight to and what not to give weight to?
Yeah, that's such a great question. And that's the scary part, right? That's where you go, all right, we're delivering the sermon, but we're not delivering the whole thing. It's kind of a montage of the greatest hits of the sermon. We know and we hope that not only people watching have, some of them have read this before, and maybe we're going to give them a new perspective. Some who've never heard the Sermon on the Mount before, we're hopeful that they'll go check it out because it's really good. The book is better than the movie. We started with what are the elements of the sermon that most speak to the people in our story. So with Simon Z, who's a former zealot, Jesus is talking about revenge, right? And that's a personal way of not only communicating what Simon the Zealot is going through and might be thinking, but what the viewer might be thinking who struggles with passion and justice. And we all love justice. But Jesus in the Gospels often says, leave worldly justice to the courts. But when it comes to you and when it comes to my gospel and my followers, we turn the other cheek. For Simon the Zealot and anyone who's identified with him who watches the show, that's a pierce through the heart. So we start there. What means the most to our characters in our story? And then the second one is, all right, what feels like, if we don't include it, is going to be a glaring, conspicuous hole in the sermon. I don't want people listening going, oh my gosh, I can't believe they skipped over the best
the golden
one.
Rule.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So there's a little bit of that. And then the third thing, which I will be honest, is not the first priority. But yes, there is an element where part of my experience of making this show feel current and relatable is saying, you know what they were going through back then is similar to what you're going through right now. There was oppression, there was poverty, there was a division, there was social and political and religious tribalism. And Jesus had answers for that. And I want you to hear those because they apply to today.
When you thought about Sermon on the Mount, what were some of those creative true norths that you didn't want to get wrong or you wanted to stay true to? I think one of them was showing the impact of the sermon for the disciples. I think another one we talked about was showing this shift from private ministry to more public ministry.
Sure.
Was there anything else that you guys were trying to accomplish?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think if we're going to focus on the Sermon on the Mount, it speaks to the larger true north as well. But specifically in the Sermon on the Mount, we're thinking, okay, here's an opportunity where Jesus is preaching. And not only do we want to make it make sense to our heroes of the story, but also to the audience. And the audience consists of many believers, obviously, but also many people who are on the fence, people who are new believers, people who have church hurt, people who haven't believed maybe in a while, but their grandmother told them to watch the show, and so they're considering it. And then there's the people who are skeptical of faith and religion and are not followers of Christ, which actually represents a good chunk of our cast and crew. So here's the good news. The things that Jesus is saying in the Sermon on the Mount have resonance and meaning and speak to all of the people I just mentioned. All of those groups have something in this sermon that they can hear. So you might not believe he's the Son of God in your life, but listen to this. Listen to what he had to say. Listen to how humble he was. Listen to how direct he was in other things. Listen to what his priorities really were. And that's someone who changed my life. And a lot of it is because of these teachings. So I think that's a true north for that scene, and it's a true north for the show. And the Sermon on the Mount is one really key aspect of that journey, and I hope that that's true for you.
When I was looking at Jesus kind of workshopping the Sermon on the Mount with Matthew, and he wakes him up and says,
Matthew. Bye-bye. I've got it.
The opening?
Yes.
What is it?
A map.
The what?
Directions where people should look to find me.
how did you settle on that metaphor of the map?
The moment with Matthew, my co-writer, Tyler Thompson, he wrote that line. It's a map. You know, if people want to know how to find me, this is the person they should look for.
Yes.
The person who is meek, the person. And I even get goosebumps now remembering it. I just thought, my goodness, that is so good and so resonant. And it speaks to how Matthew would be wondering.
Yes. But how is it a map?
If someone wants to find me, those are the groups they should look for.
And when Jesus answers, I just went, oh, thank you, Tyler. That is so beautiful.
It's a beautiful moment. Last question. You spent so much time thinking through how the Sermon on the Mount is going to land for characters in the story. And so as you've done that with your writing team, was there something new for you or fresh or surprising about the Sermon on the Mount?
The thing that has stood out to me is Jesus was and is a personal God. He is an intimate God. He spoke to the masses, yes, at times. But man, every time he healed, every time he called someone to follow him, every time he rebuked someone, he spoke to their specific need or their specific struggle. That has been my greatest impact in the last 4 or 5 years, is just, wow, he is the God who knows me. He's the God who sees. So that applied especially to the Sermon on the Mount. It's why I didn't show a ton of wide shots. I always knew that when Jesus came out on stage, instead of the audience standing up to greet him, they sat down. And I knew that when he delivered the sermon, it was him in the middle, surrounded by people. He's personal. Yeah. He looks at them. He looks directly at the disciples. That's a result of what I've learned about Jesus even more. The second thing is that what really hits me as someone who happens to be just under 6'4", 225, I was an athlete my whole life. I have the ability to be a fighter if I wanted to be. I don't get challenged too often. And the Sermon on the Mount, when it talks about meekness and humility and brokenheartedness, those are things that I'm not naturally. Those parts of the sermon, I think, hopefully really resonating with Simon the Zealot, Big James, some of the folks who are a little bit more aggressive, just going, man, he is just clear over and over in the Gospels. Turn the other cheek. If someone asks you for one thing, you give them an extra thing. I mean, I'll give you a spoiler alert. In season 4, the disciples are actually faced with a moment where they have to act out live out what Jesus said about if you're asked to go 1 mile, you go 2.
Oh, wow, cool.
Because that was referring to a Roman law where the Romans
Yeah.
could at any point give their equipment and the Jews would have to carry it for a mile. That's for me. That doesn't come naturally to me. I am not meek. And I am learning that man, if by the time I die on this side of heaven, I can at least make some progress towards the Beatitudes, especially the ones about you think you should get even. You think you should be strong. You think you should be first. You think you should be a leader, an influencer. No, in my weakness, I will be strong. I must die to myself. All right, that's going to take some time.
Knowing that, to say that you were so impacted when the line was written, if someone wants to find me, those are the groups of people that they need to look for. The meek, the lowly, the poor in spirit. That it impacted you still says a lot about the Sermon on the Mount, that it could cut through all of that. This is who Dallas is.
Oh, man. Yeah, absolutely. And isn't that the best thing that you can do? It's what the Bible Project does. It's what The Chosen has been doing, is how often you hear the word, aha, or, oh, I never, ... is the greatest thing you can hear. If scales can be removed from eyes so that scripture can become even more clear, what could be better written on your tombstone? That's what the Sermon on the Mount can do. And if The Chosen can be part of that, kind of re-energizing or refocusing people's experience with these 2,000-year-old transcendent words, there's nothing better.
Good word. Thank you, Dallas.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me on.